Hello again. We're going to take a look now at the 1920s woman. This section is from chapter 21, section 2. It's in your book on page 646. Okay, the 1920s was, as we've talked about in Changing Ways, it was a period of great cultural change, but more so for women, specifically white women, than many other different groups. And this has many different reasons. We're going to take a look at this in the notes. And the big question that we're going to look at here is, to what extent were women able to shake off patriarchal oppression? This patriarchal oppression refers to kind of like the idea of men ruling by just the natural order of male domination. And of course, for many of you, you know that men have held in history many different forms of political power, being in charge of countries, economic power, being in charge of banks and large fortunes, and cultural power and influence in religion, in military power, in the arts. And so women, specifically in American society, have, held a position which is one that has often been subordinate, meaning that men have been in charge legally, men have been able to own property, men have been able to even hold themselves to a double standard. And we'll talk about that a little later. So in the 1920s, things begin to shift somewhat. Um, so we're going to take a look at the flapper as a new woman and women in the workplace. We're going to take a look at the controversy around Margaret Sanger and the issue of birth control and the differences in families. And finally, we're going to touch on the subjects of race and gender in the 1920s. So let's get right into it. The first thing I wanted to start you in with is actually a segment concerning women and their role that industrialization played in World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918. And women actually played a significant role here. And this example is from Great Britain, but it is typical of women in the United States as well. So let's take a brief listen.
The guns out there are roaring fast. The bullets fly like rain. The aeroplanes are coveting. They go and come again. The bombs talk loud. The mines crash out. No trench their might withstands. Who helped them all to do their job? The girls with yellow hands.
As men marched off to war, women marched off to work. The result was a dramatic but temporary change in the workforce of every fighting nation. But of all the professions women entered, none was more important than shell making. In Britain, 1 million women poured into munitions factories. 28,000 women worked here, on Warren Lane, in southeast London. The Woolwich Royal Arsenal was Britain's largest. This, too, was a battleground.
The first time you go around, you think, what an interesting place. Then the evil smell becomes more noticeable. The particles of acid land on your face and make you nearly mad, feeling like pins and needles.
Gabriel West knew the dangers of working in a shell factory. She first ran a factory canteen, and then shocked her father by joining the newly formed Women's Police Service. Her
We're going to take a look at a couple other factors that influence women, but one of the things that I wanted to impress upon you is the idea that by the millions, women poured into factories. Your book talks about this also, and how they were beginning to change not just the rules, as the main title suggests, but some of the factors that influence society as well. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is after World War I, women gained the right to vote. They do this in a way that that promotes vast change, specifically with the introduction of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which finally allows women to vote in this country. There are some other significant factors, but nothing plays such a stronger role than gaining the right to vote. Because now, although women contributed economically to the benefit of the country, now they were counted as a form of representation, and their voice would need to be honored and heard. In other words, they needed to be represented, or they would vote people out of office, whether those people are men or women. In 1923, women, specifically Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, created the idea of the Equal Rights Amendment, demanding that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction. Ultimately, this would not get passed through Congress, but it's interesting to note that it began in 1923. Later, this issue will come up in the 1970's and 1980's. So when we talk about flappers, that your book notes, and we go over here in the text, we notice that they talk about how women dress in new fashions. Here you'll see a group of women dancing the Charleston. Your book mentions that women were more assertive, and that they broke some social norms in that they were casually dating with men, they were smoking and drinking in public. And those things created a double standard. The double standard was that men could do these things, but not women. And that did create tension between many different groups of individuals here in the United States. It would also give women, especially educated and assertive women, the idea that there was much more work to be done in order to gain equality in the United States. And so we do take a look at women in the workplace, specifically women who contributed to not just industrialization, but the idea that there were new opportunities, not only for female college graduates, but also for women who were doing new groundbreaking things, like, for instance, Amelia Earhart, who began taking her airplane lessons in the early 1920's, and others. As we note, by the end of the 1920's, over 10 million women were working. However, many of them were confined to jobs that were considered low-paying and also subservient to men. In other words, it was very hard for women to get management positions. And that was a form of discrimination okay, and inequality that became a pattern in American history until um, the 1950s and 60s and 70s, when the women's rights movement demanded full equality. And we're still dealing with some of the, uh, the challenges that remain in order to make that more complete. Um, One of the things that we do notice here, that I did want to talk about before we get into family roles, is the work of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is probably one of the most controversial women in U.S. history, in the sense that, as your book mentions, she was one of the first to open a birth control clinic in the United States in 1916, and she founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. But one of the things that Margaret Sanger is also known more famously for, or infamously for, are some of the associations that she had with the eugenics movement. And there are a few issues that need to be dealt with and need to be expressed as far as that's concerned. Although it's an interesting study of history that we have to use very careful filter in order to find out what is true and what is not true, because much has often been said about Margaret Sanger um, that can be potentially misleading. So one of the things that we do know is that Margaret Sanger was a member of the Eugenics League. She believed in the idea of selective breeding. In this case, the idea of population control, the idea that inferior individuals should not give birth, and often that the poor needed to be sterilized or given incentives to be sterilized, and if they wanted any financial or humanitarian assistance, and they should agree to that. Some of that comes up later because Margaret Sanger is not alone in this. Presidents of Harvard and Yale University, as well as many researchers and very intelligent individuals, were also people who believed in scientific racism. And your book doesn't make mention of this at all. What it does make mention of is the fact that the family roles were changing because of some social and technological innovations. Family life and household life was changing. And if we look at the graph right here, we'll see that even though the domestic work does fluctuate somewhat between 1910 and 1930, there are significant changes. For instance, if you take a look at the percentage of women working in professional fields, from 9.1 to 11.9 to 14.2%, that's growing enormously. Women who are working in trade, 5.9%, 7.9, and 9%. Women who are involved in clerical work goes from 7% to 16% to 18%. And more significantly for rural women, the number of women working in agriculture, working on farms, continues to shrink. 22% to 12% to 8.5%. And so that's, a significant factor that points to the role that women are playing in large cities. And that, of course, is something that, gives rise to a lot of the cultural tension of that day. One other point that I did want to bring up, though, is that these issues do not affect all women's groups equally. In fact, most of these characteristics, whether they're social or economic or political, are mostly affecting white women. And even though all women gained the right to vote in 1920, we still see massive racism and segregation and discrimination against minority women, specifically minority African American women and minority immigrant women, because of any cultural barriers or economic conditions that hindered them. And that leads rise to some of the other tensions that come up later in American history, and we'll talk about that a little bit more next time. Take care.